The human ships attached to the Zetherian hull with magnetic clamps that resonated through the entire vessel. And Katie could see the fear spreading across the faces of her three captors as they realized how completely their situation had changed. In just a matter of minutes, Vex slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender that was universal across most species, and asked Katie what she wanted from them. And his voice had lost all its earlier confidence and authority. Katie moved to the communications console and opened a channel to the lead human ship, identifying herself as Lieutenant Katie Brooks, and confirming that the primary objective had been achieved, and that she had control of the alien vessel. The response came immediately, with Captain Lisa Chen ordering Katie to secure the aliens and prepare for boarding, and Katie acknowledged the command, while keeping her attention split between the console and the three Zetherians. Kip was trembling now, his scales shifting through, colors that Katie recognized from her training as indicating extreme distress, and he asked in a shaking voice whether the humans were going to kill them. Katie looked at the young alien and felt a momentary flash of something that might have been sympathy. But she pushed it aside and told him that would depend entirely on how cooperative they chose to be in the next few hours. Zarn moved slowly toward his commander, helping Vex to stand upright, and the two of them exchanged a series of rapid clicks and whistles that Katie's earpiece translator struggled to keep up with, but she caught enough to understand they were debating whether to activate the ship's self-destruct sequence. She cleared her throat and informed them in fluent Zetherian that she had already disabled that option, along with most of their other emergency protocols, and both aliens stared at her in shock, because humans were not supposed to be able to speak their language. The airlock cycled open, and 6 human soldiers entered wearing advanced combat suits that incorporated reverse-engineered alien technology with human innovations, and they moved with military precision to secure the 3 Zetherians. Katie stepped aside and watched as her team worked efficiently, binding the aliens with electromagnetic restraints and scanning them for hidden weapons or communication devices. Captain Chen entered last, removing her helmet to reveal a woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she looked around the alien bridge with obvious satisfaction before turning her attention to Katie. The captain asked for a status report, and Katie provided a concise summary of the past 20 minutes, including her assessment that the aliens had been completely unprepared for human resistance and that their intelligence about Earth was at least 5 years out of date. Chen nodded and approached Vex, directly standing close enough that the alien had to look down to meet her eyes, and she told him in clear terms that his ship now belonged to humanity, and that he and his crew would be given a choice. The commander asked what kind of choice, and his translator made his voice sound hollow and defeated. Chen explained that the Zetherians could either cooperate fully, providing all information about their technology, their star charts, their government, and their military capabilities, or they could refuse and watch as human engineers took apart their ship piece by piece. While they sat in confinement, Vex looked at his 2 crew members and then back at the captain and asked what would happen to them if they chose to cooperate. Katie stepped forward and explained that they would be treated as prisoners of war under human conventions, and that once Earth had extracted all necessary information, they would be returned to their people with a very clear message about the consequences of future interference. Kip spoke up suddenly, asking how long humans had been planning this trap, and Katie smiled and told him that the planning had begun almost immediately, after the first confirmed abduction 3 years ago. She walked to the main display and pulled up a timeline showing how human intelligence had tracked every Zetherian incursion into Earth's solar system, and how they had used each incident to learn more about alien technology and tactics. Zarn stared at the display and realized with growing horror that the humans had been studying the Zetherians just as thoroughly as the Zetherians had been studying humans, but with far more success. Chen ordered her soldiers to escort the aliens to the human dropship for transport to a secure facility, and as they were led away, Vex looked back at Katie and asked a question that had been bothering him since she first broke out of the containment cell. He wanted to know if she had really volunteered to be abducted or if she had been ordered to do so, and Katie considered the question for a moment. Before answering, she told him that she had indeed volunteered because she had spent her entire military career preparing for the possibility of contact with alien species, and when the opportunity came to be the first human to board an active alien vessel, she had jumped at the chance. Vex nodded slowly and said that in a strange way he respected her courage, even though it had led to his capture, and Katie replied that respect between warriors was something she could understand regardless of species. The aliens were taken away and Katie was left alone with Captain Chen and two technicians who immediately began cataloging the ship's systems and downloading data from the navigation computers. Chen asked Katie how she was holding up physically and emotionally, and Katie admitted that the adrenaline was starting to wear off and that she was beginning to feel the strain of the past few hours. The captain told her to take a break and get some food from the dropship, but Katie insisted on staying to help with the initial assessment of the alien technology because she had trained specifically for this mission and did not want to miss any crucial details. Chen smiled and said that was exactly the kind of dedication she had expected from Katie, and that command was already talking about promotions and commendations once they returned to Earth. Katie shrugged and said she had not done this for recognition, but rather because it was necessary and because someone had to be the first to prove that humans were not helpless victims but capable defenders of their own world. The technicians called out that they had successfully accessed the Zetherian database and were beginning to download star charts showing the locations of dozens of alien civilizations, and Chen whistled softly as she realized the scope of what they had just captured. Katie joined them at the console and watched as centuries of alien exploration data flowed into human computers, and she thought about how much this single mission would change everything about humanity's place in the galaxy. One of the technicians pointed out a cluster of markers relatively close to Earth's solar system, indicating other Zetherian research vessels, and Katie suggested they might want to set up a welcoming committee for those ships as well. Chen agreed and began drafting orders for the fleet to intercept the other vessels before they could warn their home world about what had happened here. Katie felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her but pushed it aside because there was still so much work to do and so many questions that needed answers. She thought about the other humans who had been abducted over the years and wondered how many of them were still alive and where they were being held, and she made a mental note to press the Zetherian prisoners for that information during interrogation. The ship's systems beeped and flashed as the technicians continued their work, and Katie realized that this moment marked a fundamental shift in human history. No longer would Earth be a target for curious aliens looking for easy specimens to study, and no longer would humanity wait passively for contact to happen on someone else's terms. From this point forward, humans would be active participants in the galactic community, whether other species liked it or not. And Katie felt a surge of pride knowing she had played a crucial role in making that possible. Chen placed a hand on her shoulder and told her that she had done well, and that future generations would remember this night as the moment when humanity stopped being prey and became hunters. 3 days after her abduction, Katie stood in a secure briefing room deep beneath the Nevada desert watching as military analysts pored over the data extracted from the Zetherian scout ship, and she was still processing everything that had happened and everything they had learned. General Patricia Morrison entered the room, carrying a tablet filled with intelligence reports, and she looked tired but satisfied as she took her position at the head of the conference table and called the meeting. To order, Katie sat between Captain Chen and Dr. Raymond Cole, the lead xenobiologist who had been studying the physical samples taken from the captured aliens, and around them were 24 other personnel representing different branches of military intelligence and scientific research. Morrison began by congratulating everyone involved in the successful capture of the alien vessel, and she noted that this single operation had advanced human knowledge of extraterrestrial technology by decades, if not centuries. She then turned to Katie and formally commended her for her courage and execution of the mission, saying that her actions had exceeded all expectations and that she would be receiving the Defense Distinguished Service. Metal Katie accepted the praise with a simple nod, but she was more interested in what they had learned from interrogating the 3 Zetherian prisoners than in medals and ceremonies. Morrison seemed to sense this and moved quickly to the intelligence briefing, starting with a holographic display of the galaxy that showed the known territories of 17 different alien civilizations. Dr. Cole stood and explained that according to the Zetherians, Earth had been under observation for approximately 40 years, and that during that time more than 200 humans had been abducted for various research purposes. Katie felt her jaw tighten at that number and asked whether they had any information about where those people were now. and Cole said that most had been returned with their memories altered, but at least 60 were still unaccounted for. A younger analyst named Helen Park added that the Zetherians had shared locations of several research stations where human subjects might still be held, and that rescue operations were being planned but would require careful coordination. Morrison explained that they could not simply charge in with military force because many of the facilities were located in neutral zones or territories controlled by other alien species who might interpret human aggression as a threat. Katie understood the political complications, but she also knew that every day they delayed meant another day those people spent in captivity, and she asked whether there were any diplomatic channels they could use. Chen spoke up saying that the Zetherians had agreed to help negotiate the return of human captives in exchange for certain considerations, and that preliminary talks were already underway with their homeworld government. Katie asked what kind of considerations, and Morrison said that humanity had agreed not to publicize the capture of the scout ship for 6 months, giving the Zetherians time to quietly withdraw their research vessels from Earth's sector. In return, the aliens would provide detailed information about other species who might pose a threat to Earth and would advocate for human membership in what they called the Galactic Council. Dr. Cole brought up another hologram showing the political structure of known space and explained that the Council was more of a loose federation than an actual government, but it did establish certain protocols for interaction between species. Katie studied the diagram and asked why humanity had never been invited to join before, and Cole said that according to Zetherian sources, Earth had been classified as a developing world, not yet ready for contact. Morrison added with a tight smile that this classification had now been forcibly revised, and that several council species were demanding emergency sessions to discuss the human situation. Helen Park interjected with a concern that some of the more powerful alien civilizations might view humanity's aggressive response as evidence that humans were dangerous and should be contained, or even eliminated. Katie felt a chill at that suggestion, but Morrison assured everyone that diplomatic teams were working around the clock to present Earth's actions as justified self-defense rather than unprovoked aggression. Captain Chen pointed out that possession of the captured Zetherian vessel and its database gave humanity significant leverage in any negotiations because it contained sensitive information about multiple species. Morrison nodded and said that several alien governments had already made unofficial inquiries about whether humanity would be willing to trade certain pieces of information. Katie wondered aloud whether it was wise to start playing political games with civilizations that had centuries more experience in galactic diplomacy, and Morrison replied that they had little choice but to engage. Dr. Cole changed the subject by presenting findings from his examination of the 3 Zetherian prisoners, and he noted that despite their reptilian appearance, they shared surprising biological similarities with humans. He explained that this suggested either parallel evolution or the possibility that life in the galaxy originated from a common source, and Katie found herself fascinated by the implications despite the tactical nature of the meeting. Morrison brought them back to practical matters by outlining the next phases of the operation, which included training additional personnel for potential boarding actions and developing countermeasures against alien detection technology. Katie was assigned to lead the training program based on her successful experience, and she accepted the responsibility, knowing that her knowledge could help protect other humans who might be put in similar situations. Chen mentioned that intelligence indicated at least 3 other alien species had research vessels operating near Earth and that reconnaissance missions were being prepared to identify and track those ships. Katie asked whether the plan was to capture more vessels or simply monitor them, and Morrison said the decision would be made on a case-by-case basis depending on the level of threat each species represented. Helen Park brought up data showing that one species called the Vren had been conducting abductions more aggressively than the Zetherians, and that several of the missing humans were likely in Vren custody. Dr. Cole added that the Vren were significantly more advanced than the Zetherians, and that attempting to capture one of their ships would be much more dangerous. Katie absorbed this information and asked whether the Zetherians had provided any intelligence about Vren weaknesses or vulnerabilities, and Morrison said they had received some tactical information, but its reliability was questionable. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from technological analysis of alien weapons, systems to psychological profiles of different species, and Katie filled notebook after notebook with information. When they finally broke for lunch, Katie found herself walking with Chen through the underground facility, and the captain asked how she was really doing after everything that had happened. Katie admitted that she had trouble sleeping because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the Zetherian crew members and wondered whether she had done the right thing. Chen told her that second-guessing successful missions was a luxury they could not afford, and that Katie had potentially saved countless future abduction victims by proving that humans would fight back. Katie understood the logic, but she also could not shake the feeling that they had crossed some kind of threshold and that there would be consequences they could not yet anticipate. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Chen asked whether Katie planned to continue with active operations or transition to a training role. Katie said she was not sure because part of her wanted to be involved in any future rescue missions for the missing humans, but another part of her recognized that her knowledge was more valuable if shared with others. Chen nodded and said that command would ultimately make that decision, but that Katie's input would be seriously considered. After lunch, Katie returned to her quarters and found a message waiting from her family, asking when she would be able to visit because it had been months since they had seen her. She sat on her bed staring at the message and realized how much her life had changed in just a few days, and how much it would continue to change as humanity adjusted to its new reality. Katie thought about the 60 missing humans still somewhere out there among the stars, and she made a silent promise that she would do everything in her power to bring them home. She also thought about the future and what it meant that Earth was no longer isolated and innocent, but instead had become a player in the complex game of galactic politics. Katie understood that the path ahead would be difficult and that there would be setbacks and possibly even conflicts with species far more powerful than the Zetherians. But she also knew that humanity had proven something important on that scout ship, and that no alien species would ever again make the mistake of thinking humans were helpless prey. She stood and walked to the window that looked out over the desert landscape, and wondered how many other people around the world were having their lives transformed by the revelation that humanity was not alone. Katie knew that eventually the full story would become public, and that society would have to grapple with all the implications of contact with alien civilizations. 3 months after the Vren rescue operation, Katie found herself in an unusual position as she walked through the corridors of the first human embassy on the neutral station known as Gateway 7, where representatives from 40 different alien species conducted diplomacy and trade. Ambassador Caroline Fletcher had requested Katie's presence at the formal introduction of humanity to the Galactic Council, and Katie wore a dress uniform that felt strange after so many weeks in combat gear. Embassy was still being furnished, but already it represented a statement of human presence in galactic affairs, with Earth artwork on the walls, and a viewing screen showing live feeds from major cities around the planet. Katie stopped in front of a painting of the Grand Canyon, and thought about how much her world had changed since that night in the Oregon forest, when she had allowed herself to be taken by the Zetherians. Fletcher emerged from her office and smiled at Katie, saying that the council delegates were assembled and ready to hear from the human representative, who had initiated first contact. Katie followed the ambassador through security checkpoints, staffed by neutral species who scanned them for weapons and biological threats before allowing them to proceed to the council chamber. The chamber was enormous, with seating arranged in concentric circles that rose toward a domed ceiling that displayed a holographic map of known space. Katie counted delegates from at least 30 species, and she recognized Zetherians and Vren among the crowd, along with dozens of aliens she had never seen before. A tall being with crystalline skin and multiple limbs called the session to order and introduced itself as mediator. Prime, the current chair of the council ambassador. Fletcher was invited to speak first, and she delivered a prepared statement about humanity's desire for peaceful coexistence with all species while maintaining firm boundaries about Earth's sovereignty. The delegates listened politely, but Katie could sense skepticism and concern in the way many of them shifted or communicated with each other. When Fletcher finished, Mediator Prime invited questions, and immediately, several delegates raised appendages, or tentacles, or whatever they used to signal attention. A Zetherian delegate that Katie did not recognize stood and asked why humanity had responded to scientific research with military aggression. Fletcher looked at Katie and nodded. giving her permission to respond directly. Katie rose and addressed the council, explaining that from humanity's perspective, the abductions were not scientific research, but violations of personal freedom, and that any species that took humans against their will should expect resistance. A friend delegate interjected, asking whether humans intended to use force against all species conducting legitimate studies. Katie replied that humans had no objection to contact and exchange of knowledge, but that it must be consensual, and that taking people from their homes without permission would always be considered an act of aggression. Another delegate from a species called the Calyx asked what assurances humanity could provide that it would not use its captured alien technology to threaten peaceful species. Fletcher answered this one, saying that Earth had no territorial ambitions beyond its own solar system, and that humanity sought only to protect its people and establish fair relationships with neighbors. Katie noticed Keeper of Knowledge sitting among the Vren delegation, and the scientist made a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or approval. Mediator Prime asked a question that Katie suspected was the real reason for this session, which was whether humanity would be willing to share information about other species that it had obtained from captured vessels. Fletcher had prepared for this, and she stated clearly that Earth would respect the confidential nature of diplomatic information, but that it reserved the right to share intelligence relevant to its own security. This caused a stir among several delegations, and Katie could hear the rapid conversations happening in dozens of languages. A delegate from a powerful species called the Torvan stood and declared that humanity was too aggressive and unpredictable to be granted council membership. Fletcher responded calmly that humanity had not requested membership, but rather recognition as a sovereign species with rights equal to any other. The Torvan delegate argued that species typically demonstrated peaceful intent for decades before being accepted into the council, and that humanity had immediately resorted to violence. Katie felt anger rising, but kept her expression neutral as she waited to see how Fletcher would handle this. The ambassador pointed out that humanity had returned, captured Zetherian crew members unharmed, and had negotiated peacefully for the release of human prisoners from the Vren station. She also noted that if the council had standards for membership, then perhaps it should also have standards preventing member species from abducting sentients from non-member worlds. This argument seemed to resonate with some delegates, and Katie saw several of them nodding or making equivalent gestures. Keeper of Knowledge surprised everyone by standing and addressing the council in support of humanity. The Vren scientist stated that while the methods were unorthodox, humans had demonstrated both capacity for violence and willingness to negotiate, and that this combination suggested they understood the balance required for galactic politics. The scientist also mentioned that in the exchange of information, humanity had been honest and thorough, which spoke to their reliability as potential partners. Mediator Prime called for a recess to allow delegates to consult with their governments, and Katie followed Fletcher back to the embassy. Feeling drained from the intensity of the session, the ambassador poured 2 glasses of water and sat down heavily, saying that it had gone better than expected, but that humanity still had a long way to go before being fully accepted. Katie asked what would happen if the council refused to recognize Earth, and Fletcher said that humanity would continue as an independent power, and that other species would have to decide individually whether to engage. Over the next several hours, various delegates visited the embassy to speak privately with Fletcher, and Katie sat in on many of these conversations, learning the complex web of alliances and rivalries that shaped galactic politics. The Zetherian delegate arrived and apologized formally for his species' actions, saying that they had underestimated humanity and that his government now wished to establish proper diplomatic relations. Fletcher accepted the apology graciously and suggested that perhaps the Zetherians could help educate other species about human capabilities and expectations. Delegate from the Calyx came next, and this conversation focused on trade possibilities because the Calyx were interested in human art and culture. Katie found it surreal to be discussing exports of music and literature with an alien who looked like a large insect, but she participated enthusiastically. The Torvan delegate did not visit, and Fletcher said this was expected because the Torvans were one of the most conservative species in the council, and resistant to change as evening approached. By station time, Mediator Prime sent word that the council had reached a preliminary decision. Fletcher and Katie returned to the chamber where the delegates had reassembled, and the atmosphere felt less hostile than before. Mediator Prime announced that the Council had voted to grant humanity provisional recognition as a sovereign species, with the understanding that formal membership would require additional time and evaluation. The decision also included an agreement that member species would cease unauthorized research on humans, and that any future contact would follow established protocols for first contact situations. Fletcher thanked the Council and reiterated humanity's commitment to peaceful coexistence. Katie felt a sense of accomplishment but also understood that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey. After the session ended, several delegates approached Katie individually to express curiosity about her experiences and to ask questions about Earth. She answered as honestly as she could while being mindful of security concerns, and she found herself enjoying the opportunity to represent her species in a positive way. Keeper of Knowledge approached last and told Katie that the Vren government had agreed to help locate other research stations where humans might be held. The scientist said this was partly because of the successful negotiation, but also because the Vren had realized that humanity would not stop looking until all its people were recovered. Katie thanked the scientist and said she hoped this marked the beginning of better relations between their species. As she walked back to the embassy with Fletcher, the ambassador commented that Katie had a natural talent for diplomacy, and that her military career might evolve in unexpected directions. Katie thought about the 60 humans still unaccounted for, and the countless challenges that lay ahead as Earth navigated its new position in galactic society. She also thought about how her decision to volunteer for abduction had set in motion events that changed not just her own life, but the trajectory of human civilization. The stars visible through the station windows no longer seemed distant and unreachable, but rather like a neighborhood that humanity was just beginning to explore. Katie knew there would be setbacks and conflicts and misunderstandings as humans learned to coexist with dozens of alien species, but she also knew that humanity had proven itself capable of standing up for its rights and earning respect through both strength and integrity. 6 weeks had passed since Katie's capture of the Zetherian scout ship, and she found herself standing in the cargo bay of a modified human cruiser, preparing for what everyone was calling the most dangerous rescue operation in history. The mission was straightforward in theory but terrifying in execution, because they would be infiltrating a Vren research station located in a neutral zone between 3 different alien territories, and any mistake could trigger an interstellar incident commander. Jake Torres checked Katie's equipment one final time, making sure her oxygen recycler was functioning properly, and that her communication implant was synchronized with the rest of the team. Katie had spent the past month training intensively for this mission, learning everything available about Vren technology and biology, and she still felt woefully unprepared for what they were about to attempt. The team consisted of 12 specialists, including Katie, and each person had been chosen for specific skills that would be needed once they reached the station. Lieutenant Maria Santos was their technology expert, and she would be responsible for hacking into the Vren computer systems to locate the human prisoners. Sergeant Daniel Price led the security detail, and his job was to make sure they could fight their way out if negotiations failed and the mission turned violent. Dr. Amanda Foster was the medical officer, and she would assess the condition of any humans they found and determine whether they were fit for immediate transport. Katie's role was unique because she would be the primary negotiator if they encountered Vren personnel, and her success with the Zetherians had convinced Command that she had a talent for dealing with aliens under pressure. The cruiser dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the neutral zone, and Captain Chen's voice came through their earpieces, reminding them that they had exactly 4 hours before other species would detect the human presence. Torres gave the signal, and the team boarded the stealth shuttle that would take them the final distance to the research station, and Katie felt her heart rate increase as the bay doors opened and they launched into the void. The shuttle was equipped with Zetherian cloaking technology that had been reverse-engineered and improved by human scientists, and according to tests it should be invisible to Vren sensors. But there was always the possibility that the aliens had detection methods humans did not know about. Maria worked her console in the back of the shuttle, analyzing the energy signatures coming from the station, and she reported that it appeared to be operating at minimal capacity, with most systems in standby mode. Daniel checked his weapons for the 3rd time, and Katie noticed that his hands were steady, despite the tension everyone was feeling. The station grew larger in the viewport, and Katie could see that it was built in a modular design with several distinct sections, connected by corridors and docking ports. Torres piloted them toward a maintenance airlock that intelligence suggested would be lightly monitored, and as they approached, Katie held her breath waiting for alarms or defensive fire that never came. They docked with a soft clang that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of space, and Maria immediately began working on the airlock controls using codes that the Zetherian prisoners had provided. The door cycled open and the team moved inside with weapons ready, but the corridor beyond was empty and dimly lit. Katie noticed that the atmosphere was thicker than Earth, normal and warmer, and she adjusted her breathing to compensate while staying alert for any signs of Vren presence. Maria consulted her scanner and pointed toward a junction ahead, indicating that the holding cell should be 2 levels down in the station's central section. They moved through the corridors in tactical formation, and Katie was struck by how different Vren architecture was from Zetherian designs, because everything here had organic curves instead of angular lines. Daniel held up a fist signaling a halt, and everyone froze as footsteps echoed from somewhere ahead. Katie moved to the front of the group and peered around the corner to see a single Vren technician walking away from them carrying what looked like a data tablet. She made a split-second decision and signaled for the team to stay back while she approached the alien alone. The Vren turned at the sound of her footsteps, and its 3 eyes widened in surprise as it took in the sight of a human in combat gear standing in the middle of its research station. Katie raised her hands to show she was not immediately threatening and spoke in carefully practiced Vren language, telling the alien that she was here on a diplomatic mission. The technician made a series of clicking sounds that Katie's translator rendered as confusion and alarm, and it asked how humans had penetrated station security. Katie explained that they had come for the human specimens being held in the facility, and that they were prepared to negotiate for their release or take them by force if necessary. The Vren backed away and reached for what might have been an alarm panel, but Daniel appeared behind Katie with his weapon raised, and the alien froze. Katie repeated that they did not want violence, but that they would not leave without the humans, and she could see the technician calculating its options. Finally, the alien lowered its hand and asked in halting English what Katie was offering in exchange for the specimens. She had authorization to negotiate, so she told the Vren that humanity would provide certain technological information from the captured Zetherian database in return for the immediate release of all human captives. The technician seemed to consider this and then said it did not have authority to make such decisions, but that it could take Katie to someone who did. Daniel objected over the team channel, saying this could be a trap. But Katie decided to take the risk because it might avoid bloodshed. She told the Vren to lead the way and gestured for her team to follow at a safe distance. They descended through the station, passing laboratories filled with strange equipment and chambers that Katie tried not to think too hard about. The technician brought them to a large chamber where a senior Vren scientist was working, and the sight of armed humans clearly shocked the scientist, who immediately began speaking rapidly to the technician. Katie stepped forward and introduced herself formally, using the protocol she had learned, and she repeated her offer to exchange information for prisoners. The scientist, whose name translated roughly as Keeper of Knowledge, studied Katie for a long moment before responding that the humans in question represented years of valuable research. Katie countered that continuing to hold them would result in human military action, and that the Vren should consider whether that research was worth starting a conflict with a newly aggressive species. Keeper of Knowledge made a sound that might have been amusement or concern, and said that reports of the Zetherian incident had indeed reached Vren space. The scientist asked what specific information humanity was offering, and Katie provided a list that Maria had prepared, focusing on Zetherian navigation technology and biological data. Keeper of Knowledge consulted with the technician in rapid Vren that Katie's translator struggled to follow, and then turned back to her with what might have been a nod. The scientist agreed to the exchange, but insisted on verifying the information before releasing the humans, and Katie said they could transfer a sample immediately. Maria came forward with a data chip containing a portion of the Zetherian database, and the Vren scientist inserted it into a nearby console. While Keeper of Knowledge examined the data, Katie asked how many humans were currently being held at the station, and the scientists said there were 7 specimens in various stages of study. Katie felt anger rising, but kept her voice level as she demanded to see them immediately to verify their condition. The scientist agreed and led the team to a lower level, where a series of cells held the human prisoners. Katie looked through the transparent walls and saw men and women of various ages, all looking confused and frightened, and some showing signs of medical procedures. Dr. Foster moved from cell to cell making quick assessments, and she reported that all 7 appeared to be physically stable, though clearly traumatized. Keeper of Knowledge announced that the information sample was acceptable, and that the scientist would authorize the release of the specimens in exchange for the complete dataset. Katie signaled Maria to begin the transfer while Daniel and the security team prepared to move the prisoners. The cells opened one by one, and the humans stumbled out, looking around in confusion until they saw Katie and the other team members in their clearly human military gear. One of the prisoners, a woman named Claire Murphy, asked in a shaking voice whether this was real or another experiment, and Katie assured her that they were being rescued. The team moved quickly to get the 7 former prisoners back to the shuttle, and Katie stayed behind long enough to complete the data transfer and make sure Keeper of Knowledge understood that any future abductions would be met with force. The scientist acknowledged this and said that the Vren Council would be informed of humanity's new stance. Katie rejoined her team, and they hurried back through the station with the rescued humans moving as fast as they could manage in their weakened state. They reached the shuttle without incident and sealed the airlock behind them, and Torres immediately initiated launch procedures. As they pulled away from the station, Katie watched it recede into the distance, and she felt a mixture of relief and frustration because they had saved 7 people, but 60 more were still out there somewhere. The stars looked different from inside the Zetherian scout ship, and Katie Brooks knew she should probably be more afraid than she actually was. But years of training had prepared her for exactly this moment, and as she sat on the cold metal floor of her cell, she counted her breaths the way her instructors had taught her during those long months at the facility in Nevada. Commander Vex stood outside the transparent barrier, watching this strange human female with growing confusion, because in all his cycles of service across dozens of worlds, he had never encountered a specimen quite like this one, and something about the way she held herself made his scales prickle with an emotion he rarely experienced, which was doubt. The ship hummed with the familiar rhythm of faster-than-light travel, and Katie used the sound to ground herself as she took in every detail of her surroundings, from the blue-tinted lighting to the strange symbols on the control panels that she had spent months learning to read in preparation for this very night, Zarn. The second officer adjusted his position near the navigation console and muttered something in his native language to Kip, the youngest member of the crew, who was still staring at Katie with wide eyes filled with curiosity because this was his first actual field mission, and he had expected the experience to be more exciting than watching a calm human sit quietly in a cell. Katie knew they were confused by her lack of panic, and she used that confusion to her advantage as she slowly stood and stretched her arms above her head, making sure to keep her movements casual and unthreatening while she memorized the location of every camera and sensor in the room. The abduction had happened exactly as planned, with Katie hiking alone through the dense forest outside Portland when the beam of light surrounded her and pulled her upward into the waiting craft, and she had forced herself to remain limp and unresisting during the transport. Even though every instinct screamed at her to fight, Vex activated the communication system, and his voice came through with a mechanical quality as the translator converted his clicks and whistles into English, telling her that she would not be harmed, and that this was simply a routine examination for scientific purposes. Katie turned to face him and smiled in a way that made all 3 aliens shift uncomfortably, because there was something knowing in that expression, something that suggested she understood far more than she should, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "How many others have you taken from my planet?" she asked, and Vex hesitated before responding that their research had required several specimens over the past few solar cycles. Katie nodded slowly and walked closer to the barrier, running her fingers along its surface as if testing its strength, while she asked more questions about their ship and their mission and their homeworld, and with each answer Vex gave, she filed away another piece of information. The truth was that Katie had volunteered for this mission 3 months ago when military intelligence confirmed the pattern of abductions and realized they could use it to their advantage, and she had spent every day since then preparing for this moment, studying alien technology, learning their language and training her body to withstand the stress of space travel. Kip watched her with fascination and asked Vex in their native tongue whether all humans were this calm when faced with the unknown, and Vex replied that no. This one was different somehow, but he could not identify exactly what made her different. Katie pressed her palm against the barrier and felt the slight vibration of the energy field that kept her contained, and she remembered the briefings where scientists had explained the weaknesses in Zetherian technology, and how their shields operated on a frequency that could be disrupted with the right amount of force applied at precise intervals. The ship suddenly lurched as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and Katie grabbed the wall to steady herself while Zarn called out coordinates to Vex, who moved to the main console and began inputting commands. This was the moment Katie had been waiting for, because she knew from intelligence reports that Zetherian ships always stopped at specific checkpoints during long journeys to recalibrate their navigation systems, and during these stops the power to non-essential systems was temporarily reduced to conserve energy. She watched as the lights in her cell dimmed slightly and felt the barrier weaken just a fraction, and she knew she had approximately 30 seconds before full power returned. Katie took 3 steps back and then launched herself forward, striking the barrier with her shoulder at the exact weak point that had been marked in her mission briefing, and the transparent wall shuddered, but Vex spun around at the sound, and his eyes widened in alarm as he realized what she was attempting, and he shouted for Zarn to reinforce the containment field immediately. But Katie was already moving again, and this time she kicked the barrier with all her strength, channeling months of physical training into that single point of impact, and the wall cracked with a sound like breaking ice. The 3 aliens stared in disbelief as the crack spread across the surface of the barrier like lightning frozen in glass, and Katie stepped back, breathing hard but keeping her eyes locked on Vex. Kip frantically worked the controls, trying to activate emergency protocols. But Katie had been counting on their panic and confusion to slow their response time, and she struck the weakened barrier one more time with both fists. The wall shattered into countless fragments that dissolved into harmless energy particles before they could reach the floor, and Katie walked through the opening with her hands raised to show she was not holding any weapons. Vex reached for the plasma rifle attached to his belt, but Katie was already closing the distance between them, moving with a speed and precision that spoke of extensive combat training. And before he could draw the weapon, she had grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back. The rifle clattered to the floor, and Vex made a gurgling sound of pain as Katie applied pressure to a joint that, according to her briefing materials, was particularly vulnerable on Zetherian anatomy. Zarn abandoned his post and rushed toward them, but Katie swept Vex's legs out from under him, using the commander's own body weight to send both of them crashing into Zarn, and all 3 went down in a tangle of limbs. Kip stood frozen at his station, unable to process what was happening, because nothing in his training had prepared him for a human who fought like a trained warrior and moved like she had been studying their species for years. Katie rolled away from the pile of aliens and came up in a crouch next to the main control panel, and her fingers flew across the interface as she accessed systems that should have been completely foreign to her, but which she navigated with practiced ease. Vex struggled to his feet, clutching his injured arm, and stared at Katie with a mixture of fear and confusion, asking how she knew their systems and how she had broken through their containment field. Katie glanced at him while her hands continued working and told him that humans had been watching the Zetherians for far longer than they realized, and that every abduction, every experiment had been carefully documented and studied. She pulled up a holographic display showing dozens of tracking markers, each one representing a Zetherian vessel that human satellites had been monitoring for the past 3 years, and the aliens watched in growing horror as they realized the full scope of their miscalculation. Zarn finally found his voice and asked whether this meant Earth was more advanced than their initial surveys had indicated, and Katie smiled grimly as she disabled their weapon systems and told them that Earth had been playing a very long game. The ship's proximity alarms suddenly activated, and Vex looked at the monitors to see 3 large craft approaching from different vectors, and he recognized them as human design but far more advanced than anything their intelligence reports had suggested was possible. Katie stood and backed toward the airlock, keeping her eyes on the three aliens and informed them that her extraction team had arrived right on schedule, and that they now had a choice to make about how this encounter would end.